the trade war is confusing to a lot of people. Like, what the hell is he trying to do? Like, do they not have any common sense in economics?
So
Uh,
this is
yeah.
exactly because I that's me. To people, you say to people it's confusing. It me. I'm the confused. I'm the
No, no,
confused
it is
party.
really confusing because even for economists, like, nobody in the White House is paying attention. But I think there's a nefarious motivation behind it, which explains why the tech bros are so close to him. This is really about Europe, for the last 10 years have been trying to heavily regulate the American tech companies. They're just monopolies, basically. The US is not doing it. The Europeans are trying to do it. And that's a blind spot in a lot of people's thinking about the trade deficit, because we do have a trade deficit in goods, like manufactured stuff, like physical things. But the US has a huge advantage in services. And the tech companies are basically selling code, they're selling software, and they're avoiding taxes left and right in every single jurisdiction. And they are the ones who are now facing the aggressive regulation, anti-monopoly regulation by the European Union. And Trump is coming to protect them. So he's telling the
Okay.
Europeans, give up
Mhm,
your
mhm.
regulation and I'll will not, impose tariffs. It's precisely about the tech companies.
Okay, so that makes all the sense in the world and is incredibly clarifying. We're just getting into it. You're listening to
Oh,
Associate Professor Fadhel Kaboub from Denison University, kind of cracking open the mystery of the discourse around the tariffs. Now, if you listened to last week's episode, you would have seen we had Lori Wallach on. We recorded the day before the tariff plan was actually announced, and she sort of set the stage for how tariffs work and how they can be a sort of economic populist tool that brings trade back. You know, the rhetoric that Trump is using to justify what he's doing right now. But now that we've seen the way that the tariffs have been deployed, it is fascinating to me, Professor, to hear you say that this is ultimately about shoring up the interests of the tech billionaires that have been both literally and figuratively behind Donald Trump since the start of his administration.
absolutely. I mean, when you think of the narrative of the Trump administration from the beginning about the trade deficit, it's it's very misleading because you would think that if a country like the US has a trade deficit, like all other countries that have trade deficits, the value of its currency would have been falling over the last several years, several decades. But the value of the US dollar has been stable and steady. Why? Because the US has another mechanism to offset the trade deficit, because the trade deficit is in trade in actual physical goods. The US has a huge surplus to offset it in the trade of services and financial services, legal services, and tech services. And this is where the tech companies come in. And that means also profit repatriation for shareholders in the tech industry and other industries. This is what offsets the U.S. trade deficit. Other countries in the global south, in particular, who have trade deficits, they don't have a Wall Street and they don't have tech companies to offset their trade deficit, and that's why their currencies are weaker. So, and from a US perspective, there is literally no economic problem when it comes to the trade deficit being offset by a surplus in other sectors of the economy, which is the strength of the US economy. So it's an invented problem. So why is the Trump administration inventing a problem and going after it without highlighting the fact that the US has a huge trade surplus? It's because the European Union, primarily for the last decade or so, especially the last few years, has been trying to aggressively regulate the monopoly power of the tech companies, of the Googles and the Microsofts and all the tech companies that dominate the global economy, including the European market. So they're saying you either sell off portions of your business so that you create a competitive market in the digital and the tech industry, the high tech industry, or we're going to go after you with these punitive measures. So the Biden administration did face off with the Europeans a little bit, but Trump and his administration are going in with full force. They're basically telling the Europeans, if you don't let go of your aggressive regulation against my tech bros, from Silicon Valley, I'm going to impose all of these trade restrictions on you, on all these tariffs.
Okay, I
And
have a couple. Okay, I'm sorry.
yeah,
Go ahead and finish. I didn't mean to interrupt.
and that is really the motivation behind it. There's other motivations behind why imposing tariffs on everybody around the planet. It's because, this is part of the Trump, style of negotiations. It's about disrupting the situation, putting the other side kind of backed into a corner, confused and not knowing what's coming at them, so that he can get the upper hand in negotiations. The ultimate point is not imposing the tariff. The ultimate point is getting the upper hand to get whatever he wants from different countries.
So that's exactly what I was going to ask. It's confusing because at this point, I'm sure most people have seen the sort of chart of what the tariffs are going to be for various countries and the discourse around whether or not they had like some kind of rote equation that isn't really tethered to any real economic rationale to pick the tariff numbers against various countries, and that it does seem, generally speaking, just punitive. These are my enemies. I'm going after them. And China is, at the top of the list as the biggest enemy because of its competitive power. And so the idea that this is actually about Europe, I think, to me at least, and maybe to some of the listeners, feels sort of like it makes sense on one level because of who Trump has aligned himself with, but also discordant with the kind of broader narratives that are percolating about what Trump's motives are. So I want to drill down on this a little bit. You say that the America's ability to export services and these technology services is part of what stabilizes our currency. And apologies again, everybody knows that I'm like the woman who never took econ and I'm fumbling my way through this. But my understanding was part of it was because the dollar is a global reserve currency. Everyone has bought up all of these reserves of dollars. That is part of what everyone's sort of equally invested, yoked into the idea of America's currency being stable. And that is part of why we don't suffer the same kinds of currency fluctuations from having a trade deficit as, let's say, countries in the global south.
Not necessarily. I mean, the fact that the U.S. Dollar is a reserve currency, it doesn't really, change the fact that if you have a trade deficit, your currency should get weaker. But if you have a surplus in your capital account, in your, trade in services, then that should offset it, which means that your central bank, the Federal Reserve Bank, doesn't have to intervene to stabilize the value of the dollar relative to the euro, relative to the British pound or the Japanese yen. It's the power of the U.S. as a geopolitical and military entity doesn't completely explain the economic strength of the U.S. economy, but it does contribute to it because the U.S. does police international trade, does police access to technology, does police a lot of things. But it's very important for us to separate the technical issues because then that would imply, if that was the case, that would imply that no country on the planet can be as successful as the US unless it becomes a geopolitical hegemon and an imperial power, which is not true. What we're trying to argue is that countries can thrive and prosper and have stability and achieve all their major macroeconomic goals and climate goals without becoming a military superpower on this planet. And I think that's very important for us to understand, because otherwise we're doomed as humanity into either submission to imperial power or creating so much tension for no good reason when everybody can thrive in a peaceful and stable global economy.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the kinds of regulations that the EU has been trying to put on these monopolistic tech companies? If there's someone listening who thinks, well, I don't know, in a kind of America first sort of way, hands off our tech companies. Why should Europe be allowed to meddle in our business anyway? Whose side should I be on in this fight over these regulations? I mean, what kind of regulations are we actually talking about?
I mean, these are regulations that we should be having in the United States to begin with. Antitrust laws, meaning not allowing a single company to become a monopoly. Because when you're a monopoly, when you control the vast majority of your industry, that means competitors can't enter the market, which means you become a price setter and you become a price, you become an abuser of your customers, which means you mark up your prices, you exclude competition, and you can, because the power of the influence of the tech companies and social media, you can influence how your consumers access information, how they access the truth, and you can influence what they think and how they consume, which is a superpower that no other industry in the past was able to have. If you
Mm-hmm.
think of producers who manufactured things in the past, they can have market power and they can abuse their market power and they can set prices and they can exclude competitors, but they can't tell you how to think and they can't tell you the truth about news and information and political systems in your own country and outside the country. This is why the tech companies are extremely powerful because they control an industry that controls information, that controls one of the building blocks of the democratic process, which means they can manipulate the public. So the European Union is saying if you're a successful tech company, good for you, but you can't dominate, which means you have to sell off bits and pieces of your business to create a competitive market. And if you're not willing to do that, then we're going to have to do it ourselves, which means we're going to break your monopoly. And that is essentially what antitrust regulation in the United States should have been. We've done this in the aftermath of the Great Depression. We've broken the abusive market power of banks, financial institutions, and manufacturers in the United States. This was the Pecora hearings, the Pecora investigations. For those who remember a little bit of US history in the 1930s, we couldn't actually deliver the New Deal in the United States without delivering what we call a clean deal, meaning going after the abusive market power of monopolies. So breaking the monopolies allows you to democratize your economy and allows you to deliver to the needs and aspirations, the democratic needs and aspirations of your people. And that is an exercise that hasn't been done on a scale that we've seen, for example, during the Pecora hearings in the 1930s. That is an exercise that is long overdue right here in the United States. And who's supposed to do it? The 535 lawmakers we have in Washington, D.C., who are supposed to be the government of the people, by the people, for the people. But right now we have a government of the super PACs, by the super PACs, for the super PACs. And they happen to be primarily not Wall Street anymore, but as Yanis Varoufakis, the Greek economist, the former finance minister, has labeled them. These are the techno-feudalists. We live in a feudalist system, not a capitalist system, controlled not by the traditional landlords who own the land, but the guys who own the cloud, right? The tech companies that control the entire digital infrastructure that manages all the goods and services that we consume at prices that they determine under conditions that they impose, and they manage and manipulate the information that is accessible to us to the point of manipulating how we think because they know so much about us individually because they have all of our digital data and they can process it and they can know exactly what makes us tick as consumers and they can manipulate it not just as consumers but as voters, as citizens of the world. And that is nowhere near what a democracy should look like.
You mentioned that this is a long time coming. What did the sort of regulatory battle between American tech companies and European regulators look like during the Biden administration? I'm asking this especially coming off of a weekend of these hands-off protests where there were a lot of different political sort of orientations represented, a lot of people who were very much in the Biden camp and liberals expressing understandable anger and concern over a range of issues that the Trump administration have brought to the foreground. But I think some people on the left found themselves a little frustrated, and I will count myself among them, at the tone of some people protesting that didn't seem to still to this day recognize the way that the foundations for so much of what has been happening were set under the Biden administration. So I think setting our expectations now going forward as to what we should be demanding of Democrats if and when they ever get back into power, I think is useful.
Yeah. Well, if you go back to the 4 years of the Biden administration, when it comes to uh, U.S. European Union relations, it's been dominated by the Ukraine conflict, and that's where the Biden administration sort of had the upper hand because Europe's security was dependent on U.S. intervention, NATO intervention with the biggest chunk of military contribution in terms of financial contribution coming from the U.S., intelligence contribution coming from the U.S., and so on. And what the Trump administration has taken is basically taken that upper hand that the US has with the European Union on the Ukraine conflict and leveraged it even more aggressively. We've seen what happened to President Zelensky when he showed up at the White House with President Trump and Vice President JD Vance. That was to demonstrate to Ukraine and to Europe that you are dependent on us, the United States. So you don't have, any bargaining chips in this process, which is the Ukraine conflict. Now take that and add to it the tariffs that the U.S. Is imposing on behalf of the tech companies in the U.S. with the rhetoric that it's not about tech companies, with the rhetoric that it's about unfair trade practices and so on. So the Trump administration has just been much more aggressive in settling this problem with the Europeans, settling it in a non-undemocratic way. I mean, if we had a democracy in the U.S. federal government would join hands with the European Union and other countries to regulate the tech companies, to break the monopoly power that they have. And here I should add the China component to this, because a lot of people are saying, well, if this is a battle between the US and Europe, then why is the rest of the world thrown into it? Because the biggest tech competitor moving forward is not coming from the European Union, it's coming from China. It's in the telecom industry, it's in the TikToks and the social media and the digital infrastructure. This is where the real competition is coming for the US. It's not primarily from Europe, it's from China. So this is sort of the Trump administration doing this aggressive imposition of tariffs on everyone, throwing everybody under the bus for the sake of protecting the techno-feudalists, throwing everybody under the bus, including American consumers who will be facing inflation because of the additional cost of these tariffs on U.S. consumers, because we're not imposing tariffs and simultaneously investing in the productive capacity to reindustrialize the United States. Because if we were doing that, then we'll say, okay, we created the substitute production units here in the US to provide consumer goods at a lower cost. Then the tariffs would make sense. But we're divesting from investment. You've heard President Trump during the State of the Union address say, we're taking the money away from the CHIPS Act, which was the Green Industrialization CHIPS Act, and the IRA to supposedly pay off the national debt, which means, I live in Ohio, right where Intel is right now building the biggest, high-tech manufacturing unit in recent U.S. history here in New Albany, near New Albany in central Ohio. And after the president's speech, Intel announced that they're postponing the opening of this multi-billion-dollar factory because the Biden subsidy that was given to them via the CHIPS Act and via the Inflation Reduction Act has been eliminated, with the very clear message from the Trump administration that you should not expect support from us, which creates lots of uncertainty for large investment projects of this kind. Intel also has other internal problems, but this is a major message from the federal government saying you're on your own. We're not going to, support you.
I think that's an important anecdote. The kind of pushback that I'm seeing from sort of Trump cronies on the internet, a lot of it has the tone of, well, who wants to bring those triangle shirtwaist factory jobs back to the United States anyway? American workers don't want to make clothes. American workers don't want to do X, Y, and Z job. Weirdly trying to get ahead of the argument that, like, okay, if the tariffs are about bringing jobs back into America, and Trump is obviously not laying the groundwork for that, as you and also as Lori Wallach described last week, by actually funding and creating the conditions for those jobs thriving back at home, then you have to come up with some rationale for why you're now doing these tariffs that still feels America first-ish. And the thesis seems to be Americans are too good for these jobs anyway, so they should what? Just be unemployed at the same time as all of these tech billionaires are kind of just openly admitting to AI being the solution and robots being the solution to America's labor problems. I mean, it's very dystopian, and one has to wonder how conservatives think they're going to land this plane, kind of politically, electorally.
Yeah, I mean, when I said, this policy is throwing everybody under the bus except the tech, companies. It's throwing farmers under the bus. It's throwing consumers under the bus. It's throwing manufacturers, auto manufacturers under the bus. Everybody is threatened. And it's actually risking, because if the rest of the world coordinates its retaliation, because so far we didn't see any coordinated retaliation other than the European Union, because it acts as one bloc. But if you see coordination of retaliation that really pinches the US where it hurts, which is basically to say, all of this intellectual property rights that we've been enforcing for decades at your request to protect your code, to protect your pharmaceuticals, to protect, this huge surplus in services that the US has. You know what? The rest of the world doesn't care about intellectual property anymore. We're going to take your code and replicate it. And, what are you going to do? Go sue us in the WTO? The WTO that the US now is violating all of its rules, by the way. The US is technically subject to punitive measures under the WTO rules that the US created, right? So this disruption, if it leads to a coordinated countermeasure, not country by country trying to retaliate, you impose a tariff, I impose a counter tariff. But if the coordination goes beyond imposing tariffs and goes towards isolating actually regulating the tech companies and saying, we don't believe in your intellectual property rights. We're going to take your codes, reverse engineer them, and create your competition. And we're going to push you out of the European market, push you out of the Chinese market, push you out of the rest of the world. Then the techno-feudalist will have to make a call. They either continue to support this aggressive, Trump strategy, or pull back and say, no, we'd rather cooperate. We'd rather reduce our monopoly power and still have access to the global economy. Because we're talking about isolation here. And there's lots of retaliation that is not just tariffs related. It's regulation, access to markets, and protection of intellectual property. All of that, if you continue this retaliation and counter retaliation, eventually it leads to, more aggressive trade war. And you have to remember, trade wars do lead to wars too. This is what happened essentially in the interwar period between World War I and World War II. It started with trade wars and currency wars, and then eventually became a real war. So we have to be very careful if we're trying to disrupt the system at a level of the kind that we're seeing this week. Then you can really lead to, kinds of retaliations that go beyond, a tit for tat, tariff percentage adjustment, that it can go much more aggressively towards the foundations of what this country, what this economy has had a tremendous advantage in the last several decades because of the global economic architecture that the U.S. helped design, helped police, and helped protect. So this is now potentially on the line.
I don't want to put you in the position of making sort of predictions, because we're all just, the guessing isn't that helpful. But it does seem to me, based on what you've said about the way America has already been leveraging its financial and military contribution to the war in Ukraine, that it's got Europe over a barrel. So you're saying that the EU has, in a coordinated way, retaliated somewhat, and I'd be interested to know what that looks like specifically. But, do you really imagine that there will be a kind of more global coordinated response? And if so, given how America has been willing to act with such impunity, not just in this context, but, ignoring international law, the Netanyahu flying all over the world right now to these ICC countries where he should be arrested, and all of it. Does it seem to you like Trump, with his techno feudalist backers, is willing to back down if the brinkmanship continues to escalate?
I, I think the Trump administration is under pressure because presumably this very aggressive stance that they're taking is supposed to put everybody else backed in the corner with no choice, with no option very quickly, so that the Trump administration has the upper hand to negotiate on all kinds of different issues with different parties on the Ukraine, on technology, on market access, on energy prices, on all kinds of things. But under pressure because all of this needs to be done really quickly with minimal impact on US consumers, US voters before the midterm elections. Because the farmers that are thrown under the bus, the federal workers that are thrown under the bus with Doge, the the multiplier effect of this, beginning of a recession that we may experience is completely going to backfire on Republicans in the midterm elections. And that's why you see Republicans in sensitive districts right now being very careful about what they say about the current situation. Because if they go 100% behind Trump and their district happens to be on the receiving end of very aggressive tariffs by Europe, by Canada, by others, including farmers and other sectors, then their base is going to rebel against them. But if they don't support the Trump administration in their very aggressive rhetoric and stance on tariffs, then they face the potential rebellion of the MAGA base in the midterms election. Because the MAGA base doesn't understand economics, it just understands loyalty to the president and his vision, no matter how many people you throw under the bus. So every congressional district, as we speak, has a candidate or has a person sitting in office right now doing this calculation. What do I do at the current moment? Do I step up and support the president and get the MAGA wave behind me, but throw my farmers and my district under the bus because we're losing jobs, whether it's the tech industry? I mean, Intel was supposed to bring thousands of jobs to Central Ohio, right? So if you're a Republican supporting the president's position right now and undermining the billions of dollars of subsidized infrastructure that the state of Ohio and taxpayers here actually put in the ground in the last year or so, and now Intel is saying, "Oh, sorry, we're not creating the jobs. We're postponing this," and it's because of the president's decision to go after other countries with tariffs and to pull the subsidies, the tech subsidies. Then those candidates who are running for elections and midterms, they really have to be careful if they're serious about, keeping their seat. So that's where the pressure is. This needs to happen very quickly and very successfully with minimal damage domestically. And, looking at this objectively, it's not very clear, number one, that this will be quick. Number two, that this will be minimal damage internally. And number three, that it will eventually give the US the upper hand in all the negotiations, whether it's with Europe or China or Mexico or Canada and others. So it's a lot of uncertainty, which is what you see reflected in the stock market. The stock market hates uncertainty. And that
Well,
is precisely what we see.
that's what I want to ask you about. They're calling this, the day we're recording, Orange Monday, like Trump. Let me read you some of the headlines just at the New York Times as I open it up here. Top line: Trump threatens new China tariffs on volatile day in markets. S&P 500 is near bear market territory. The tsunami is coming. China's global exports are just getting started. What is a bear market? Are we in one? And Jamie Dimon warns tariffs could increase inflation and weigh on growth. Markets swing widely as Trump administration denies a tariff pause report. Britain eases rules on electric vehicles as auto tariffs hit. Every single story above the digital fold is about tariffs, and more specifically, the stock market fluctuations as a consequence of not just Trump announcing his policy, but also apparently, and I don't know if you've been following this, some tweets by blue check accounts that are having a sort of outsized effect on the markets, and people are saying that this is another sort of version of the influence that Elon Musk, having bought Twitter, is able to exert. To your point about controlling information through having acquired Twitter. For someone like myself, there was a funny tweet going around that was like, this is a big day for girls who have all of their savings in their checking account, who are like unaffected. I related to that tweet. I'll say nothing more than that. But for people like me who are looking at these sort of dramatic looking stock market graphs, what should our takeaway from this be? If I had to explain, if you had to explain the relationship between what we're seeing here in these news stories and what Trump has done, why is this happening, and how do you expect this to sort of pan out over the next couple of weeks?
Well, it depends on how long this crisis drags on, because the longer the uncertainty, the more the damage. Not just in the U.S., but globally. I mean, you're reading the headlines from the New York Times, but read the Financial Times headlines, read any major country's headlines, and it's very similar. So it's not like the liberal media going after the Trump administration. It's like this is very, very disruptive. So the one thing about, significant declines in stock markets and financial instability is that it does several things. Number one, it wipes out wealth from your pension fund or your retirement fund. It doesn't affect the Social Security Trust Fund, which is a separate issue, but your 401k, any retirement fund, any people who are close to retirement, like people literally who are retiring in the next few months, this is serious trouble. This is serious destruction of wealth. Um, uh, Number two, if this goes on for a while, this can trigger an actual financial crisis beyond just the stock market, where you can see, margin calls kicking in, which means, people want their money back. If you have leveraged money invested in the stock market and this dip, continues and spirals out of control, then you can see kind of the circuit breakers stop working, because we've seen circuit breakers now put in place. I was reading the news this morning, I think in the Korean stock market, in the Japanese stock market, and several stock markets around the planet, where they just stop trading because you continue trading and it goes further down. So there's only so much kind of damage control you can do immediately. But if things start to deteriorate, then we're talking about a major global financial crisis. And it's not a financial crisis that you can manage quietly and manage in a traditional way. This is a financial crisis in the middle of a geopolitical crisis that the Trump administration decided to unleash on the entire world, not just internally in the US economy. And so that's the kind of uncertainty that you don't want to have in the middle of a financial crisis. Because remember, all major financial crises, the kind of stability that is needed and to be restored is firm political commitment to restore stability. You remember the 2008 financial crisis. It started under the Bush administration, and the Bush administration came with a serious tone, kind of composed and saying, "We will fix this. We will do whatever it takes." The Obama administration came in with all of its flaws and everything, but with the reassurance that we'll do whatever it takes to fix this. But today we're seeing potentially a global financial crisis with the Trump administration saying, "We will destroy everything unless you do as we say." So there's no concern for this. The other thing to keep in mind is that a decline in the stock market is a gift to the billionaires, because they have the liquidity to refinance. They have the liquidity that allows them to buy some of the key companies that they want to buy at the lowest price possible. Think of your Warren Buffett, who is liquid and waits for the market to hit, rock bottom, basically, to buy all the companies that he wanted to buy at the lowest stock price possible, and therefore wait patiently for the market to recover, to reap the benefits, and to increase concentration of market power in the hands of the few. So this is a disaster. The other thing that some people are saying, I'm not saying this is part of the Trump calculation, but it certainly factors in, which is when you force a recession and a market crash of this kind, you compel central banks, including the Fed, to lower interest rates. And that is supposedly part of the Doge strategy for balancing the budget and paying off the national debt. Because you lower the interest rate, you lower the debt service that the federal government has to pay for bondholders, right? Which is, a side effect of this disaster, because they're obsessed with reducing the deficit and supposedly paying off the national debt.
All right. I'm glad you brought up Doge. When I initially reached out to you, like weeks or months ago even, to do this episode, I had initially wanted to focus on the Doge of it all. And to get your analysis of it from an MMT perspective, you have the whole country now really ratcheting up the conversation about treating the national budget like a bank account. And a willingness to cut every program under the sun, the Department of Education on down, to balance this budget that MMTers know doesn't exist in that way. Subsequently, there's been this interesting development wherein Elon Musk found the magic money computers and seems to have acknowledged in this odd interview that he did recently with Senator Ted Cruz that, yes, the country can print its own money.
One of the things you told me about is what you call magic money computers at the Treasury. So tell us about it, because I never heard of that until you brought that up.
Okay, so you may think that that the government computers all talk to each other, they synchronize, they add up what funds are going somewhere, and it's it's coherent. There's and that the numbers, for example, that you're presented as a senator, are actually the real numbers.
One would think.
One would think. They're not.
Yeah.
Okay. They're not totally wrong, but they're probably off by 5% or 10% in some cases. So I call a magic money computer any computer which can just make money out of thin air. That's magic money.
So how does that work?
It just issues payments.
And you said there's something like 11 of these computers at Treasury that are sending out trillions in payments?
They're mostly at Treasury. Some are, but there's some at HHS, there's one or two at State, there's some at DOD. I think we found now 14 magic money computers.
14, okay.
They just send money out of nothing.
Elon said it's, quote, insane the U.S. government has computers that can just make money out of thin air. Ever since America fully abandoned the gold standard in 1971, however, international finance has depended on just that. Is Elon Musk an EMTer now? An MMTer now?
No, I mean, he's discovering something that MMT economists have been saying for at least the last 30 years, which is, yes, sovereign governments like the U.S. federal government do have the power of the purse, and they do create money out of thin air. I mean, the US dollar can only come from one source. Nobody on the planet is allowed to issue the US dollar. It's counterfeit if you try to print the currency. So the federal government is the issuer of the currency, and Elon Musk found the computers to prove it. He found 14 computers in the Treasury and other agencies. He did not find the computers at the Federal Reserve Bank because he's not allowed in there because the Fed is independent. But Ben Bernanke told us during the 2008 financial crisis in a very famous 60-minute interview when he was asked, where did you find the money to bail out the banks and to issue all of these lines of credits to all kinds of banks? When Congress at the time was wrestling to approve a bailout package of some $300 billion at the time, and there was so much objection to it that it's too much. And at the same time, Ben Bernanke at the Fed was issuing trillions of dollars worth of bailout to the financial system. He was asked directly, where did the money come from? Is this taxpayers' money? He said, no, it's not taxpayers' money. Then where did you get it from? He said, we have a computer and a keyboard. We just add a bunch of zeros and we credit somebody's account, and that's how money's created.
Is that tax money that the Fed is spending?
It's not tax money. The banks have accounts with the Fed much the same way that you have an account in a commercial bank. So to lend to a bank, we simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account that they have with the Fed. So it's much more akin, although not exactly the same, but it's much more akin to printing money than it is to borrowing.
You've been printing money.
Well, effectively, and we need to do that because our economy is very weak and inflation is very low. When the economy begins to recover, that'll be the time that we need to unwind those programs, raise interest rates, reduce the money supply, and make sure that we have a recovery that does not involve inflation.
He's not kidding about printing money. The Fed issues U.S. currency. That's why it says Federal Reserve Note on all the bills in your wallet. This is the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, just a few blocks from Bernanke's office. The Fed's mandate from Congress is to put enough money in the system for maximum employment, but not so much that it sets off inflation. The Fed actually pays for itself and returns billions in profits to the Treasury.
So Ben Bernanke explained it a long time ago, and that's how all government spending works. It's, computers with keyboards that have digits on them. You type the number and you deposit it in somebody's bank account. It doesn't mean that we should be doing this left and right and spending money left and right in infinite amounts of way. MMT is saying basically, we do have the financial capability to invest strategically in areas in the economy where we need strategic investment. That means we don't have to give tax cuts to the billionaires to beg for their, money or permission to invest in a better economy. That means that we need to separate the taxation side of the equation from the spending side of the equation. It also means that the government doesn't need to borrow its own money from banks or from other countries or from billionaires in order to spend on social programs. It means you invest strategically with an eye towards the risk of inflation. Because what can trigger inflation is not the fact that you spend, the fact that you can spend in an area where you have a lack of productive capacity. In other words, if we increase spending and that triggers demand for housing, that triggers demand for energy, that triggers demand for higher education, for example, or that triggers demand for food items. But the food system is controlled by a monopoly. The energy system is controlled by a monopoly, and there is shortage of productive capacity in the healthcare sector because the American Medical Association refuses to train more doctors and refuses to invest in the productive capacity of the healthcare sector, makes it an exclusive for-profit sector. Then any additional spending will cause inflation triggered by those inflation pressure points. So MMT is saying, first identify the inflation pressure points and then go after them to minimize the risk of inflation. And we do that in two ways. Number one, by spending to increase the productive capacity, train more doctors, train more nurses, build more affordable housing, you increase the productive capacity. Number two, you tax and regulate the abusive market power of key players in each one of those sectors. And what I'm describing here is essentially deficit spending that is anti-inflationary by design, deficit spending that is strategically democratizing the economy. And if you go back a few years, we had a program that was designed to do specifically this in the case of the US, because people thought it was, the favorite shopping list of the left. It wasn't. It was designed to target the inflation pressure points, the monopoly pressure points of the US economy, which is healthcare, real estate, energy, higher education, and so on. And that was the Green New Deal proposal, right, which was designed to be anti-inflationary. So this is what Elon Musk is discovering, but he's not discovering the full MMT picture. He's discovering this thing that he thinks is so outrageous and nefarious that the government can actually create money out of thin air, right? That we should not allow the government to have that power. Who should have the power to control the economy, to direct financial resources, and to tell everybody what to do? The techno-feudalists. They're the ones who are allowed to control the system in an undemocratic way.
I really appreciate that sort of MMT like primer again, and you're reminding me of an earlier conversation we had that was really instructive for me. I recall it. I reference it all the time, where you broke down those, 4 or 5 areas where you want to spend to increase our productive capacity, those areas that are really driving inflation: education costs, healthcare costs, transportation, energy, housing, I think you said.
Exactly.
And as I'm hearing you say this again, and as I've been listening to this abundance discourse over the last few weeks, I can't help but see some relationship between these things. And I wonder if you see it the same way. It seemed to me when I was reading the book, and as I'm hearing you talk, that there is this desire to, they're not saying any of these terms, but increase the productive capacity, build more houses. But in other areas, they are sort of indifferent to what it would mean to actually have more supply in healthcare, whether it's training more doctors, free public education, a Medicare for all system that cuts out the middleman, all of these other kinds of things. And that is what I think has raised so many people's suspicions about what the real project of abundance is. What you just described sounds like an abundance program that I can get behind. But their sort of narrow focus combined with a indifference to also the anti-monopoly aspect of it seems to be what's triggered so many folks on the left, including the anti-monopoly left, people like Zephyr Teachout, who came out pretty early as critics of what's being offered by this book.
Yeah, I mean, we have to decide as a nation if we want to strengthen the democratic process or not. If we're going to strengthen the democratic process, then we have to accept that the role of our government, the 535 elected officials, is to be the government of the people, by the people, for the people. And that means delivering to the economic and democratic needs and aspirations of the population. And the population wants to have access to education, to health, to affordable housing, to all the things that we all agree we should have universal public services in this area. And there's a completely different philosophy that says, no, you should not have universal public services. You should, be restricted from having access to those things so that you can hustle in the, in this economy with 2 or 3, jobs with no job security, no health security, none of that, so that you can hustle for income to have access to those. And that's the philosophy of the tech bros, by the way, is that the government should provide a universal basic income, very small universal basic income to all individuals, and then remove all of these universal services, healthcare, education, everything. So basically give you maybe $1,200 a month so you can actually pay your rent and maybe have a little bit of food, but not enough to survive or thrive.
Whose rent?
So now you need to
what part of the country? $1,200 a month. My goodness.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry.
You need to hustle. You need to hustle for these part-time jobs with Uber and with all of these part-time options that the tech companies are offering for us to do remote work or in-person work, but with no mandated number of hours, no labor rights, no social protection, no retirement, no healthcare services. So you have to hustle for these services and pay for them out of pocket. Who wins from this? Not the average person, but the tech companies, right? So this is incumbent upon us as a society to look forward, kind of a few years, a few decades forward, and see where this trend is taking us. And then we decide if we want to accept where this trend is taking us, or to put an end to it and restore the democratic process. And that means facing off with our elected officials and saying, which side are you on? Are you on the side of the people, the democratic process, or are you on the side of the soup PACs that underwrite your elections? And that is for Democrats and Republicans. I'm not making this as a problem that the Republican Party deals with. This is fundamentally a problem for everybody, the 535 elected officials. And we see both Democrats and Republicans throwing their own voters under the bus.
And this is exactly where I want to go. This is exactly where I wanted to go, because all that you've described, from the gosh, gee, we've got magic money computers of it all, to the, Trump managing to piss off everybody because he's ruining their retirement accounts. Rich people are mad at him. Working class people are mad at him. Farmers are mad at him. Bankers are mad at him. Everyone's mad at him. There seems like this huge opportunity has opened up for the Democratic Party to not only just advocate for sort of a more populist tariff strategy, for instance, or to say, yeah, actually MMT is a thing, and this is how we could be using it to increase the productive capacity of the United States in all of these areas where Americans are suffering. But we're not really seeing that. I don't want to minimize some of the pushback that Democrats have been doing.
There's some pushback, but to be honest, this is exactly what I've been looking for in the last few weeks. I'm looking at, midterm elections coming up, which means candidates need to be stepping up their messaging basically today if they're going towards the midterm elections. And I'm kind of browsing the airwaves and turning on my radar detector for who are going to be really, the rock stars of this midterm election that are coming with a very aggressive, different narrative to completely undo this whole nonsense. And to be honest, I see nothing, nobody that really stands out as, the candidate or candidates, ideally plural, that completely upset the current discourse. And I think that it's all about the narrative. Because if you fundamentally, whether you're Democrat or Republican, accept the mainstream approach to public finance, which means that you accept that the only way for the federal government to spend is exactly like you and I, which means either tax somebody or borrow from somebody. That is the dominant narrative. If you accept that, then you're falling into the trap of Doge, because Doge is basically saying, what the Tea Party has been saying for the last 10 plus years, which is taxed enough already. If the government is going to spend, it's going to either tax or borrow. And we're taxed enough already. And borrowing today means you're going to tax us in the future to pay for it. So we don't want any of that, which means the only option available, if you're not going to tax or borrow, the only option available is to reduce spending substantially, which means Doge, right? You cut programs left and right. The opposing party, the Democratic Party, fundamentally believes in this. They believe in taxing and borrowing in order to spend. What MMT is offering is saying, no, actually all government spending logically comes from direct issuing of new money into the system. Those are the computers that Elon Musk found. And that taxation and what we call borrowing are actually not what you think of them. So we progressives should be saying, let's tax abusive market power out of existence, not because we need the money or the permission of the billionaires or the speculators to have social programs. We tax because we want to democratize the system. We tax because we want to reduce inequality. We tax because we want to eliminate pollution or speculation in the system. That's a very important function of taxation, but it's not to pay for government programs. And the so-called borrowing, why does the government borrow its own money, right, if it can create it out of thin air? Because most people think of it as me borrowing from a bank, so it's a real burden, and it's a real debt that I have to settle at the end of the month or at the end of the year. The federal government doesn't need to borrow its own money. The federal government is selling bonds that promise to pay you back at some point in the future, plus interest, right? What's the purpose of selling those bonds? It's not the government borrowing its own money. The purpose is to get you, the consumer, to postpone your consumption, to abstain from consumption, at least temporarily, and with the incentive of paying you back with interest. And it's a AAA rated, never at any risk of default type of asset. The best example I can give you to prove this is how we financed World War II. If you remember, World War II came after the Great Depression, the most miserable time in US history. There was no money, literally no money to be taxed in the economy and no money to be borrowed. And now we faced a major government spending challenge to win the war, to start manufacturing tanks and airplanes and so on. So the government immediately created money to hire thousands and thousands of workers to build tanks and airplanes to fight the war. And that gave millions of workers income that they could have used in a free society to buy houses, to buy cars, to buy whatever they want. It's a free country, right? And that would have caused inflation or even hyperinflation. So to prevent the inflation from happening, we offered all the good citizens, leveraging sort of the patriotic mood of the nation, we offered them freedom bonds, government bonds, in other words, war bonds, and saying, look, you have all this money that we just pay you. What about you give us that cash? We give you these pieces of paper that promise to pay you back in 10 years, basically after the war. And what you do basically is you abstain from consumption. You know what? Because we have no productive capacity to build any new cars for you, any new houses for you, no consumer goods because we're busy producing for the war. And that's exactly what US consumers did. They abstained from consumption during the war. And during the post-war period, when the soldiers came back, when the productive capacity of the US was shifted away from manufacturing tanks and airplanes back to producing, cars and dishwashers and furnitures for homes, that's exactly when those same savers received their money back from those government bonds. And now they have their cash, we have the productive capacity, and they went on a shopping spree to buy new houses and new furniture and all of that. And that was the post-war boom. So the bonds, the war bonds that were not issued to finance the war. The war was already financed with actual government spending, like with those 14 computers that Elon Musk discovered, except at the time there were no computers to do that. It was done technically the same way. So the spending is completely independent. It was for the purpose of winning the war. The taxing and the quote unquote borrowing was done to manage the risk of inflation. We are in the same world today. Nothing fundamentally changed in terms of how governments spend, which means we can decide today to spend on all of our national priorities. If the national priority, like in 1942, was to win the war, that's the national priority. What is our priority today? Is to have affordable housing, to have health care, to fight the climate crisis. Whatever we decide as a democratic society, we set a list of programs that we want to achieve. And that is the spending. Then we figure out the taxing, the regulation, the quote unquote borrowing to manage the risk of inflation, to manage the abusive market power of key players in the economy that prevent us from prioritizing those issues. And this should not be considered a political right versus a political left. This is what a democratic society deserves.
So why then, in your estimation, is neither the political left or the political right, as represented by the two major parties, saying exactly this? And I know this is a political question.
Sure.
But what you're describing sounds so obvious and so clear. And the opportunity to make this argument in a way that really owns Republicans is wide open. Mm-hmm. And yet, I've never, correct me if I'm wrong, are there any Democrats in Congress who embrace modern monetary theory?
The ones who understand it and have heard of it, clearly all of them were at some point or another exposed to it, have absorbed it and kind of kept it on the shelf. They have not taken it public.
It's Ben Bernanke is saying it, but we can't get, I presume some squad members or something maybe, but are they even
using it aggressively? Yeah, exactly. Right. It's the articulation. So when Elon Musk said, I found the computers, did you hear anybody from the Democratic Party saying, well, thank you very much, this is how we use those computers? Nobody.
Not a soul.
Because they all believe that Elon Musk discovered something really nefarious about the irresponsible government spending money left and right with no accountability. And that is the nonsense that they put up front, right? And I think that this is going to be the turning point. You either shift the narrative and create the paradigm shift that we need, or you just sit on your hands and accept your fate, which is the tech billionaires now running the White House on their own terms for their own benefits. And, good luck, in the midterm elections or any other elections after this, because your people are being thrown under the bus and you're not able to do anything about it.
part of why I feel like we're so doomed. I'm sorry. But, I was at these protests last weekend, and I was looking around, and what is frustrating and dispiriting is seeing the kind of the willingness and the appetite for these arguments. That people are angry, they're in the streets. Bernie and AOC are packing auditoriums for an oligarchy tour. Like, the energy is there. It's not like the people's fault per se, but the folks who could channel it in the direction and like name the enemy are completely unwilling to do so, presumably because they're captured within the party. Even people like Bernie and AOC are unwilling. They're doing an oligarchy tour where they ignore half the oligarchy. They ignore that their party is the oligarch party, and that they're going to tell you, and they have done since time immemorial, to vote for them regardless, without any reforms whatsoever as a condition of your vote. And you're seeing increasingly conservatives making arguments, whether good faith or bad faith, but making arguments that are the lane that the left should be occupying. I think Tucker Carlson just had a really great screed about how we shouldn't go to war in Iran. It's like, what is happening? Like, what is actually happening? And that to me is what makes me feel more hopeless about political resolution to our current problem than just the fact of what Trump is doing or the fact of what Elon Musk is doing. It's the fact of the demonstrated unwillingness of the Democratic Party to act in the ways that it needs to, it would have to put the country back on track. And I don't know what's going to happen on the right, but I am pretty confident about the Democratic Party's complete and total unwillingness to do the thing that could potentially give us an off-ramp to this situation, because we're looking at it and they're not doing it.
Yeah, I mean, the Democratic Party had the opportunity in the last 10 years or so to shift gears, to shift the narrative, to really leverage the momentum that the, Bernie and AOC and the Squad movement has built, from the Occupy Wall Street movement onwards. And with the rise of the MMT narrative, to provide actually the economics that actually allows you to aggressively move forward with a progressive public policy agenda that is anti-inflation, that is anti-monopoly, that is pro-middle class and working class, that democratizes the economy. All of that was available. The handful of politicians on the left who had access to that narrative, to the economics of it, decided for whatever reason not to put it up front.
And Bernie didn't do it either. On the campaign, we were told,
sure,
not to answer questions about how he's going to pay for it with MMT answers.
Exactly.
But, on his website, there's pay-fors. We're going to tax billionaires this much, and this is how much Medicare for All saves, and yada, yada.
I think that's lazy politics and lazy economics, and sort of insulting to the intelligence of the public, because the assumption was that this is too complicated for the public to understand. So we need to tell the people a narrative that fits their understanding of how things work. So if they believe in the tooth fairy, we tell them about the tooth fairy, right? If they believe in Santa, we tell them about Santa. And that is insulting. I mean, can you imagine going to a 20-year-old kid and telling them about the tooth fairy? That's insulting. This is essentially what the progressives have done. They understand that there is a different way to do this. They understand that it's a powerful narrative, but they don't believe that their constituents are intelligent enough to listen. I mean, Bernie Sanders, when he goes on stage, he has a crowd listening with passion for an hour, right? Bernie Sanders should be able to explain an alternative narrative in 10 to 15 minutes and do it again and again and again in front of thousands of people. But he decided not to, right?
And he's not running for anything right now. Like, I can maybe understand the argument that says, I'm not prepared to spend 25% of all of my speeches in the middle of a presidential election explaining MMT. It's like too late. We should have laid the foundation for that years ago.
You don't have to call it MMT.
But it's now's the time. Like, you're going to keep ending up in that situation where you're like, it's too late to explain it if you don't do it now. What is the point of having the platform? To your point, what's the point of being up there for an hour in front of these huge crowds with the Democratic Party, like, sort of supporting your project because it's an anti-Trump project, if not for doing this foundation work. Besides which, it ignores the extent to which the prevailing narrative about the government being like a household bank account, a household budget, is a mythology that was actively created and fomented by the Republican Party, not just that came out of the sky like the Ten Commandments.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, it's your job to persuade. It's your job.
Especially today, Elon Musk did half the work for you. He already discovered the computer and talked about them. So all you have to do is just say, okay, so here's how those computers work, and here's the logic of what we should do. But unfortunately, we don't have. That's why I was scanning the horizon to see which political candidates in office or out of office are actually standing out with a completely different narrative. You're not going to win this by repeating the same narrative. It didn't work in 2016. It didn't work in 2020. It's not going to work by repeating the same mythology about the tooth fairy to grown adults who understand that you're not going to be able to deliver. Because if you accept the mainstream narrative, then you have to explain who are you going to tax and who are you going to borrow from. And that's it. You're constrained. Then you're in Doge territory and you're trapped, which means that your opponents have the upper hand. They already have the Tea Party on their side, MAGA on their side. They have people panicking about their own personal debt and thinking that the government has a similar debt that needs to be paid off. That narrative is so powerful. You're not going to undo it by kind of tweaking around the edges of, no, I'm going to tax this a little bit more or that a little bit more. Good luck getting Congress today to decide to tax the tech billionaires, the billionaires who underwrite all the super PACs that give them their seats. It's just not going to happen. So you have to expose the fact that this entire framing is misleading and is counterproductive and anti-democratic. It's not enough to say the billionaires and the 99% and all of that. You have to have the economics that goes with it. And that's what MMT provides. And unfortunately, that's what politicians on the left refuse to take forward, even though they know this really well. They've been exposed to it by Stephanie Kelton, by others. The information is accessible. This is not a secret, plan, right? This has been, on the books and social media, accessible on all kinds of platforms for at least 30 years. And it's been
Professor
tried
Kelton
before. This is how we won World War II.
Yeah.
Right? This
such an important anecdote.
The U.S. had the biggest deficit, an increase in its national debt in history without causing inflation. So we set the national priority. We achieved it with success without causing inflation. And it wasn't done because we taxed somebody or borrowed for somebody to finance the war. That is the big lesson. Same thing during COVID. How did the COVID relief money come from? Who did we tax? Who did we borrow from? It was deficit spending, immediately creating. But it was done.
But then the Republicans hop into this argument. They say that inflation was caused by the spending, having no relationship to the global supply crisis that was the pandemic in the first instance.
This argument, again, proves the MMT narrative is absolutely correct. And all MMTers at the time said that the problem is not creating the $2 trillion to send checks to individuals. That's the easy part. The difficult part is actually addressing the inflation risk that the COVID crisis created, which is the fact that we have a shortage of oxygen, a shortage of logistical capacity to actually deliver, actual goods and services to consumers. We had a shortage of capacity to produce a vaccine that will end the pandemic, that will actually restore economic activity, restore productive capacity, so that the additional demand that we created with the $2 trillion will be actually met by productive capacity. And what else happened during COVID? We did not touch the abusive market power of all the key players in the economy. And that's why you see everybody saying the pricing environment is favorable to us. They literally use these phrases, right, publicly, which means we're going to increase our markup to take advantage of the COVID crisis, right, in all industries. Whether it's shipping industry, whether it's groceries, whether it's everybody on the corporate side said, this is our opportunity to raise prices because we can, and nobody's paying attention. But MMT was saying, spend on the priority, build the productive capacity, tax and regulate abusive market power. All of that was ignored, and the only thing we did is just send checks to everybody.
And Lori Wallach, who was on again last week, I think did a really good job running down the price gouging of it all. I really strongly encourage folks who want a kind of a primer on tariffs as a tool to go back and listen to that episode. I do think it was really helpful for me going into this the following week. But I do want to ask you about one bit of feedback that we got from our conversation with Lori Wallach as we wrap up here, Professor Kaboub, which is that some people in the audience were a little unsettled by some of the framing with respect that she's with respect to China in particular. And I push back in the context of the episode a little bit.
Part of the whole notion of what is the economy we need to meet our goals and what tools do we use to create it would be the progressive way, the industrial policy way, more the Biden-esque way of thinking about why we want to make this stuff here. Because number one, to get just directly to your question about the energy stuff, the way it's produced in China and in some other countries is not a net environmental plus. So it may be cheaper and it may be faster in the short term, but they are making it burning dirty coal. So the life cycle analysis of that solar panel, of that EV, even if you are feeling virtuous using it here, is you have done so much damage to the climate in the making of the cheaper thing on the other end, that life cycle wise, and there's a lot of analysis done about this very question in trying to figure out, do you sequence stuff in, do you go right away? The White House was doing this during Biden. In the climate part of the White House, trying to do the math of like, should we let more of these dirty panels, dirty in the sense of the value of carbon emitted making them was going to be more than you could possibly save in the 30-year life cycle of that thing on your roof or in an electric. So number one, life cycle analysis, it doesn't actually meet the goals. Number two, availability and reliability of source is a big deal. So as we saw during COVID, if one part of the world is the only place something is mainly being produced, and right now China is producing, for instance, 80% of residential solar. So if whatever happened and they concentrate the areas where these, so in they call it solar city, in the part of China where this is largely being done, if it went down, the implications are enormous of having it so concentrated with respect to, even if it wasn't net carbon net loss, you just wouldn't be able to get this stuff. So that's number two. Number three, you can't have a scenario where how you save the planet is you use Uyghur forced labor and basically have production based on torture and, vicious suppression of basic human rights. That is not a long-term, I'm not signing up for that, to have that in my house when we have another option. So yes, can you have people exploiting those arguments for pure protectionist reasons? That is true. Do we also know that, in fact, in Mexico, real independent labor unions are still getting squashed? It's somewhat better under the, NAFTA 2.0, but it's still a big honking problem, and that people are still being disappeared for standing up for their rights, and that is not okay. Yes, as a value, as progressives, we need to actually use our wallets to try and say, ixnay, that is not okay. There are international standards. Every human being should have those protections, and I'm not going to incentivize the opposite behavior.
So one of the commenters in the Patreon put it this way, and maybe between that clip and this, you can respond. They said, I found her perspective valuable, and this was an informative episode. I find it interesting that conservatives make the argument that because there is a trade imbalance, there is cheating. And that is the kind of framing that she used in the episode, that China is cheating with its trade advantages. The goal is to have tariffs to correct the trade imbalance, not to create a level playing field, i.e. equality of outcome rather than equality of opportunity. This is the exact opposite argument they make when it comes to affirmative action. Maybe China is just more productive and the U.S. can't continue to consume more than it produces. So I guess the question is, how would you advise us to look at arguments about forced labor camps, environmental abuses that so often get brought up in the context of China. And that seem to be deployed with the goal of justifying trade policies that are protectionist and not necessarily of American workers, but of the other interests that you've sort of described earlier on in this episode. How can we tell the difference? And are there ways to make these sort of arguments that benefit American workers without talking about China in this sort of like red scarish sort of way that seems to kind of selectively cherry pick, environmental abuses or humanitarian abuses in a way that can be really easily sort of manipulated and exploited?
Yeah, very good question. So there's a few things here that we can unpack beyond the U.S. and China, because the supply chain is not just China and the U.S. There's the places where those critical minerals or strategic minerals are extracted from the DRC and other places that also experience quite a bit of the imperial power of the global north, kind of colonial, abusive and extractive systems that persist to this day and that actually feed into, the electronics that we're using and the solar panels, even if they're not assembled in China. So a couple of things. One is we do want to increase the productive capacity of the US, of Europe, of the global south, of China, in producing the renewable energy infrastructure so we can once and for all phase out fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. So the fact that we're going to manufacture things supposedly cleaner here in the US with natural gas doesn't really, win the argument. Number two, when it comes to the narrative about, China and labor rights and the Uyghur and all of that, this is, I have to say this from the beginning, this is above my pay grade in the sense that there's so much propaganda. And we know this, we discover this bits and pieces from different reportings by independent journalists. It doesn't mean that, it's heaven for workers in China and for the environment. It's not. But the excessive rhetoric of this is being kind of the worst thing on the planet, we have to take that with a grain of salt, because we don't have reliable independent analysis and reporting that actually supports the narrative that this is abuse of human rights and labor rights and environmental rights at the scale that we hear of on the US side of the media. So that's all I can say about that. But then the other thing is bringing the rest of the world into this analysis. If you look at the major economic blocs who have made explicit commitments to decarbonizing their economy, their transportation, their energy system, that's the US, China, and Europe, the European Union. And when I say the US, it's the Biden administration, not the current administration, clearly. But those three major economic blocs, their vision about how to decarbonize their energy system is by continuing to reproduce the global economic hierarchy that was designed during colonial times to lock the global south at the bottom of the hierarchy, to be the place for cheap raw materials, especially critical minerals, to be extracted for the industrialized world. And that is the colonial role that persists to this day and is being reproduced with this green transition, supposedly. Number two, for the global south to be the place where industrial output and technologies from the global north is sold in the large global south markets, including green technologies. So the global south is not allowed to manufacture its own solar panels or wind turbines. It's going to get loans from the World Bank and other lenders to borrow money to install solar capacity imported from China or from the US or from Europe, which means reproducing the debt trap. And number three, and most importantly, the global south is going to continue to play the same colonial role of being the place where we outsource the obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the industrialized world, and therefore to be locked permanently at the bottom of the global value chain, at the bottom of the hierarchy. That is exactly what the US, European, and Chinese Belt and Road Initiative effectively do for the global South. You continue to be locked at the bottom, and we're going to use all the critical minerals. We're still going to compete with Europe and the US and China, competing very viciously today for access to these critical minerals, the majority of which are in the global South, in order to introduce these green industrial policies in Europe and the US and in China. The US now, it's obviously being interrupted by Trump, but the thirst for critical minerals by the Trump administration is still there. You see it with the DRC, you see it with Ukraine, because those strategic minerals are not just for solar panels, they're also for the high-tech military industry, which is the focus of the Trump administration.
The Greenland stuff, I've seen arguments that the Greenland bid is about that as well.
Yeah. The Ukraine, Greenland, anywhere where critical minerals exist. So in a sense, the Trump administration is continuing the Biden administration kind of aggressive move to restore U.S. access to critical minerals. This is an industry that China, for the last 30 years, has dominated to the point of dependence. And in the U.S., we're dependent 60, 70, 80% on Chinese refining of critical minerals, because without refining critical minerals to the level of purity where you can actually use it in microchips, and then critical minerals are useless unless you have the refining capacity. And today, China dominates the refining capacity. And that's why they're critical, because they're critical not just for the energy transition, they're critical because all the high-tech products use critical minerals. So the current position of the major economic blocs, US, Europe, and China, is for the global South to be left with no critical minerals to industrialize themselves, to develop themselves, to manufacture and deploy the green energy infrastructure that they need as a building block for development and prosperity. So that has to be taken into account. We can't just focus the conversation on solar panels produced in China versus the US, which one is cleaner, which one is better, and kind of neglecting the fact that the rest of the world, the global majority, is being thrown under the bus in the same colonial position to be abused in the name of this green transition. And that is unacceptable. If we're progressive, we have to be progressive at home and abroad. We have to be consistent. And Martin Luther King said it a long time ago. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Whether it's climate justice or racial justice or economic justice, we have to be consistent and we have to be open about it.
Professor Kaboub, I learn so much from you every time you come. I strongly recommend folks who listen to this episode who haven't listened to your other episodes on bad faith and obviously elsewhere in the world, do so. The last time you were on, you really elaborated on that last point about how we could solve the climate crisis if the global South were allowed to have this green transition. And for some of the reasons you just alluded to, the global North would not allow it to. And that was, it really was like a chiropractic adjustment to my core understanding of the world in a way that was really enriching to me. And so thank you for that. And thank you for your time with us here today. It has been similarly edifying. Can you tell the people listening where they can find more of you and your work on the internet and beyond?
Well, first, I have to thank you for this opportunity again, and thank you for the compliment. I've received a lot of compliments in the past, but I was never told that I've delivered the equivalent of chiropractic adjustment.
In a good way. I know the chiropractors get a bad rap. I don't mean it in a scammy way. I just mean that I'm shook.
Yeah. I know what you mean. Thank you. People can find me on social media. Just look for my name, Fadhel Kaboub. I teach at Denison University, and I write on Substack, and it's free and accessible, and it's called Global South Perspectives on Substack.
All right. And thanks to all of you for listening. You know, you can get an additional episode of Bad Faith Podcast every Monday at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. Thank you to all of you who also participate in the comment section. I don't always reply, but I definitely am reading them. And shout out to the commenter whose comment I read on the podcast today. I learned a lot from you guys as well. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourselves. And as always, keep the faith. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.